Hey everyone, welcome to Demand Drive's on-demand webinar, Avoiding the Pitfalls in Building Out a Sales Development Function. My name is AJ Alonso and I am one of the hosts and co-moderators of this webinar. We're here to talk to you guys about how to build out a successful sales development program and what you might want to avoid when going through that process. So I have with me here today Alex Ellison, the Marketing Communications Manager at Demand Drive. Alex, say hi to the folks out there.
Hey, yeah, AJ, thanks for the introduction. Quick note of housekeeping before we get started. Obviously, since this is an on-demand webinar available for you, whenever you have the time, we're not going to be able to take questions during or towards the end of the webinar. But if you guys do have any questions, don't fret. Feel free to just email myself or AJ. Our emails are there on the screen for you. Now to sort of jump right into it, I want to introduce the experts we have with us today, Dan Paul and Lindsay Frey, the co-founders here at Demand Drive. Lindsay, you want to tell them a little bit about yourself?
Great, thanks Alex. As Alex mentioned, I'm Lindsay Frey, one of the co-founders here, and Dan and I, we started Demand Drive back 8 years ago. We're actually coming up on our 8-year anniversary, April 1st. We really started the company to help technology companies avoid some of the pitfalls that they see when building out sales development teams internally. So, excited to talk to you guys a little bit about that today. And Dan, I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So Daniel Paul, the other co-founder here at Demand Drive. Lindsay, we built this company largely on her experience, both building and managing sales development teams, for in an outsourced capacity, and then at software companies. It's actually where we met. And so over the years, I think you've developed a pretty keen sense of what's worked and what hasn't for a lot of these companies, and so we kind of built that into a lot of our processes. And we, at this point, we've helped over 100 enterprise technology companies build it.
200.
Yeah, it's been a few. With that, let's jump right into some of the pitfalls.
Let's just jump right into it. So, Dan, we'll let you start. Pitfall number one. Let's just go for it.
Sure. So pitfall number one is metrics, and I have a couple things written down here. We have vanity metrics. The idea of vanity metrics, tracking the wrong
Looking
things.
at the wrong metrics.
Looking at the metrics and we call them vanity metrics because they make you feel good. All that.
Face value, they help you.
Exactly.
Deep down,
they're meaningless.
They're actually meaningless. You put up a high meeting number and everybody's
and it's like, wow, that
SDR
got 25 meetings this month.
But it doesn't have any impact on the bottom line.
Yeah, but they actually didn't qualify anybody, and only 2 of them happened, and they both were terrible.
And they weren't within their targets.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
But hey, 25.
25, got 25. You get your management team off your back. You can show them a nice slide with engage that looks like you're dominating goal.
Like way over
in
the green.
And then cost per lead versus cost per opportunity.
Yep.
So we hear it all the time, cost per lead, but it really doesn't take into account the effectiveness of those leads. And
what does a lead mean? Like a lead.
Exactly. You can establish some sort of
to the appointment setting.
Lead definitions and things like that. But if you're not tying the cost to some sort of relevant part of the sales funnel that you can forecast accurately towards closed business, then it's meaningless, because you can have the cost per lead of 23 leads might be $400 a lead, which is great, but if it's not producing anything, then what's the point?
Yields $0 in overall revenue.
So really, it should be like a lead yield is what it should be. So this is how many, the actual yield of each lead. If you were building an ROI case, right? Yeah. Each lead equals X in revenue, because it's been informed by all the conversion rates throughout the sales funnel.
Right.
Like SAL to SQL conversion rate, or SQL to opportunity and opportunity to close.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dan, no, those are some really good points in terms of taking a look at some of the pitfalls to avoid when it comes to looking at high-level metrics and conversion rates. But I don't know, Lindsay, if you want to dive into some of the more granular day-to-day metrics that people might want to avoid pitfalls in that area.
Maybe people have moved away from this, focusing too much on the call volume, right? The actual call volume, 150 calls a day. And again, I think that talks to sort of what at the end of the day, what does that really mean and what does that really yield? Because there's a point of diminishing return, usually somewhere between 70 to 100 activities per day.
And it's probably
not able to do
really any more all that effective.
No.
You
You can
know,
do
not-
other effective things like targeted emails
Right.
to make up for some of that lost activity.
Social touches, and to be honest, a
Right.
lot of that time that you've spent just flat out calling
Right.
people is probably better spent trying to better personalize a message
Right.
Because then
to
all
a
the
specific person.
Right.
That if
Has
you're
a higher chance
you have to
of
kind of
converting.
you have to merit your you have to kind of
Tier.
no, like if you're going to
Furious
if you're going to
just
cut down
jump
on let's say instead of making 70 activities a
Yeah.
day, you do 40, but
you have to make up for
the,
that.
the connect rate and the lead rate of the 40 are 2.5 times higher than they would be if you're making 70. Then it's way more effective to make 40.
Right.
You know what I mean? So if the time is spent better
Right.
spent personalizing a message or trying to get in front of somebody.
And it takes some time to figure out what that right combination is,
Yeah.
right? So some
Yeah.
clients, the right combination is 40 activities and a lot of research, and some clients it's 80 activities and a little bit less research. But you have to do testing, and it takes about 90 days before you're going to really know.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what it isn't, and it's not 150.
No, it isn't.
Right.
And this
Calls
is
a day.
also brings up a good point about sales enablement tools like
Yep.
Sales Loft and Outreach.io,
Yeah.
which are effective tools. But we've worked with clients, and Lindsay, I know you know this. You went into a number of clients where they're over-tooled. They're
Yeah.
like their SDRs are
Yeah, we've
totally
talked about
robotic.
this, yeah.
And I think there's an
Referred to
interest.
in the last
Do
webinar.
you remember that meeting we had with the private equity firm? They
Yeah.
came in. It was like a VC firm, and they were looking for a partner like ours to then roll out to all of
Yes.
their
Yep.
their
Portfolio
companies.
companies, yeah.
And I could tell that a lot of the answers we were providing them, they weren't totally happy with. Just so the audience knows, they didn't choose Demand Drive. But I think they were thinking about it wrong because, and they even talked about this in recruiting. They were like, how do you guys recruit? And we brought Sean in, and Sean
Yeah.
is our recruiting guy. He's awesome. And they were like, so what traits do you look for? Do you guys do personality testing? And
Yeah.
our answer was no to the personality testing
Yeah.
because it's ineffective. First of all, with regard to personality testing, it's bogus because if you're
This gets
applying
another pitfall.
if you're applying for a job as an SDR, you're going to answer the questions
The way that you would
expect
them to
somebody
be answered
if
in
you're
order to
an
get hired.
SDR. If I'm going to
Yeah.
apply for a marketing role, I might ask slightly different. I'm going to apply for an analytics role. I'd probably
Yeah.
be like, I don't like talking to
Right.
people at parties. I like, you know what I mean? Like, so
Glasses pushed up on the
so
face.
they're meaningless. And so this was what we talked about. Like we said, no, we don't do personality testing. And Sean was like, we look for these traits, and they're fairly broad. One is intellectual curiosity. Like,
Yeah.
do we have a good way of measuring that? No,
Absolutely.
but I think we do
There
a pretty
isn't a
good
good
job of
way of measuring
identifying it.
Yeah.
And we have a great track record of hiring really, really strong SDRs. So to try to, and I guess this brings it back to like the Sales Loft and
Yeah.
so large companies, when they're building enterprise level sales development
Mm-hmm.
teams, there's an interest in making it a machine. They're like measuring every aspect of the program, which is effective, but breaking it down so much that you can plug in any human, and all they have to do is click buttons throughout. Like, here are all your templates. Never touch them. Just click here. Your touch
It's
point one on
overly
Monday.
automated.
Yeah.
On
It- you might as well
Wednesday,
just have-
Sales Loft will present you with the, hey, call this person. And you call that person, and you send this follow-up email and do a social touch on
Yeah.
Thursday. And then you just click your way through, and it's totally
Yeah,
mindless.
you might as well just have a
Yeah.
robot do it for far less.
And I'll
of
tell
the
you
cost
that
of
that
the
SDR will
SDR.
probably leave well
And that's-
before
Exactly.
a year.
Yeah, and that's
Right.
something that also needs to be said about like what you were saying, Lindsay, the 150 activities a day.
Mm-hmm.
Like you got to pump those out. Like you're gonna have an SDR last like 3 months before they're like, I can't do this anymore. Like this
Yeah.
is draining. They
Right.
And
run
then you
out
have to go
way
through the whole
faster.
process
You do
again.
it all over
Yep.
again.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not safe.
No.
Yeah,
So,
I was just gonna say that's a really interesting unintended positive consequence, I guess, of making 40 dials a day. Is your SDRs are gonna last longer. I know that, like when I was calling,
Yeah.
that I can say that now. If I had to make 100 dials a day, I probably wouldn't still be here. I would have been like, all right, I know marketing's what I want to
Yep.
do, not sales, so I gotta
Right, and
just
I
go
definitely am
find
not
some
gonna do
marketing
this,
somewhere.
yeah.
You know.
yeah. But to wrap it up with regard to the Sales Loft and sort of sales enablement tools, so I know that there's an interest in engineering it properly, and this is actually probably a good segue into our second pitfall, which
Yes.
is training and process development,
Yeah.
because those are definitely important, but you can overdo it. And so to your point about call volume, you can expect people to make too many calls. There's a
Yep.
point of diminishing returns.
Yep.
It's sort of like a bell curve, and there's
Yep.
a middle where it's most effective. You need a certain amount of volume, but
Right.
but you don't want
You're
so
giving
much
up on
that
the
it
quality if you're doing too much,
Exactly.
and you're never going to have the opportunity to
Right.
talk to enough people if you're not making enough calls.
But
So
we
there-
also see people over-engineer it with
Yeah.
metrics and
tools
tools, and they build out
Yeah.
these processes that you cannot deviate from. And so the most effective programs we give our SDRs a certain amount of autonomy to make decisions about what they want to say to prospects, and that should be the case because you can't. I mean, you can
These are
build
human beings,
you can build
yeah.
personas and you can build message maps and templates for each one. But it would be totally ineffective if AJ, you found out someone went to some college and you also went there and you just didn't mention that. That would be insane.
It's
Why
taking
wouldn't you?
out like any personality in prospecting.
Right.
It's just like you're following input A, so input B, and then
Yeah.
C, so D.
Which
Where
is
it's like
back to
people don't
doing
work
what
like
robots
that.
do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People just aren't. They don't function like that.
Exactly.
So, Dan, what is that common mindset in our space that you think leads to this robotic approach at sales development?
So we talk to a lot of people that while they know that sales development is important, they have an attitude towards sales development that it's pretty easy. It is an entry-level role, and they can hire any person to do it off the street. So oftentimes they're like, look, I could go hire a kid from college, get him a seat, get him a
Yeah.
laptop, give him a list and a script, and there you go.
He'll work alongside my sales team, and it'll be great.
Exactly. And they neglect to develop any sort of training program or build any sort of process around the sales development
Or
function.
have anyone who this person is reporting directly to.
Yeah.
It's just
Outside of like
yeah,
maybe
okay, he can
Just
report to
over
the
the
VP of
sales,
sales.
right.
Guess
Yeah.
what? The VP of sales is not
Does
going to
not
take
care.
the right
Right.
amount of time and do the right amount of work for one or two
Yeah.
SDRs. They
Yeah.
have way more to do, way more on their plate.
Right. So, what are some of the areas in terms of process that are most effective that people often overlook? Right. So, it would probably be something like a persona or a targeting strategy. Right.
Making sure
So-
they're armed with the right data and lists to be effective, and prioritizing that data.
Right.
And giving them guidance on that.
So, so the first one would be, I mean, so if you're not thinking about this strategically enough, you're probably just hiring someone, putting them in a seat, and having them report to your sales team. And what is likely happening is this person's just asking, "Hey, is this a good
One-off
target? Who
questions,
should I
yeah.
say? What should I say to this guy?" Or
Can you read
know,
this email? Like,
yeah.
And there's no.
Exactly. So
Development
I think
going
Yeah.
on.
the way we kick off programs is we have a pretty defined, it's generally weeks or sometimes a month long where we're working with the client to identify those exact things.
Well, and I think too, I mean, we have the people and the infrastructure in place that not only are going to kind of motivate and inspire the team, right, and manage the team and provide coaching and insight into the calls and access, and they'll provide direct access to the SDR versus the SDR sort of hunting out somebody to get their questions answered.
Right.
Exactly.
It's proactive
Yeah.
versus reactive, which
So
is really important.
the things that I would probably say are probably the most overlooked in terms of process development is number one, sort of creating an ideal customer profile or some sort of personas, right? So your marketing teams probably have this pretty well defined, but has that translated into an effective sales development strategy?
And also,
Do we
what's your
know-
strategy on inbound versus outbound?
So
right?
that's another one.
Yeah.
So reviewing marketing programs, lead channels, understanding how do I target those, and is there, should we develop a response time mandate like an
Right.
SLA?
And what
in
does
terms
that look like for different MQLs?
of- Right.
So, for example, right, like a contact us form should be responded
So-
to within 5 minutes versus,
Exactly.
a content download, you have a little bit more wiggle room to follow
Yeah.
up on that.
Right.
Lead qualification criteria. Do we understand what an effective lead is? Like, do we have a qualification criteria for this person they're just going to drum up some business? That's
Yeah.
the strategy. So we need to understand what types of
Questions you
questions to
wanna-
ask,
yeah.
what type of information is useful for the sales team to have in order to close business
And what
most
does your
effectively.
market look like, right? So that's going to sort of direct your qualification questions a little bit, right? If you're selling into a pretty saturated market, you may need to find someone who's in a buying cycle, who has an active project, where you can really define the use case versus if it's more of an educational sale, maybe there's not as many competitors. You have to really sell the prospect on the concept before you're selling them on the piece of technology. So in those cases, you may want to take a lead that's not quite as qualified. As long as someone has an interest in learning more, in an instance like that, may not need to get a VANT qualified lead.
Right.
And that,
And
I mean, that in and of itself, like, is if you don't have a process in place, how is an SDR going to know that?
Right.
Like if they do come across a situation like that and they're like, oh, this person's probably a great pipeline, but in like 3 months they'd be an awesome lead.
And exactly,
in the meantime, he's
that's
like,
a
give
good
me that
point.
now.
Right.
Because
There's
an
no
SDR that you're
communication.
hiring
I
is
just wrote a
probably
blog
someone
on
right
that.
out of college and someone who is not going to have a ton of experience being able to navigate this, which kind of brings us into, staying away from potentially hiring SDRs that have way too much experience where their sort of longevity is kind of coming to an end.
That could be a pitfall
Yeah.
in its own right.
Right,
So if you want to talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah.
But
I think so, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we have a lot of clients who want an SDR with 5 to 7 plus years of experience, and I have to
5 to 7.
Yeah. And listen, there are outliers. There are lifetime SDRs, and I'm sure they are good. But the persona that we've seen be the best fit is the folks right out of college.
1 or 2
who
years
are
removed sometimes.
driven,
but, yeah.
competitive, have an interest in tech because that's the industry we play
Right.
in. Have an interest in sales,
Yeah.
business in general, intellectually curious, coachable, etc. And that they, and then the
Yeah.
longevity of an SDR is 14 to 16.
You know what's
months, I
funny?
think.
It's like when you read descriptions of SDR job descriptions, or really any job descriptions, you want like self-starters, you want people that are highly motivated, and you want people that have, what are your career goals? Like you want to talk
Yeah.
about that. And then in the same breath, you're like, I want someone with 10 years experience in the SDR role. It's an entry-level role.
Right.
The best people in it, the
Move
people that are
up.
most effective
The
are
people
going
you
to...
want, you don't want them to want to be in it for more than a year
No,
and a
the
half.
people with all those traits you just mentioned are the ones that are going to advance out of this
They're
role in
hungry
2
to-
years.
to move
Yeah.
on and
Right.
do something
Exactly.
else. Yeah.
Which goes back to the first point of being able to give them the proper coaching, because these are really young in their career folks
Right.
that
Yeah.
are not going to be able to necessarily understand how to
Yeah.
put together their own qualification criteria and their own ICP.
Yeah, I mean, we do training engagements sometimes, and Lindsay, you do a lot of these for clients with existing SDR teams. And then even a lot of our clients will use Demand Drive in conjunction with existing SDR teams. And oftentimes when working with internal teams, we'll have more tenured SDRs on staff
Right.
that have been there for a number of years or
Yeah.
have several years experience. And again, there are effective ones,
Yeah.
but they can and often are stuck in certain ways and aren't
Yeah.
quite as moldable.
Yeah.
So to
Right.
Lindsay's point, I think the most effective person for this role is someone who is fairly new, early in their career, without a lot of bad habits.
Yeah.
Like that you can build the process around, and then they So.
I mean, if
Hungry
you're
and
really
knowledgeable.
gung-ho on just hiring one SDR and you
Right.
need them to be pretty autonomous and you're not going to have a manager in place
Yep.
and you don't have the time or bandwidth to give them a lot of coaching and hand-holding, then maybe you do try to find that lifetime SDR that
Right.
can be pretty self-sufficient.
That
But
just exist
outside
on
of
their
that
own.
case,
Yeah.
I think...
And then if that person leaves and there is inevitably turnover in the role, what do? You have to start from scratch.
Right.
All that knowledge leaves with that one person.
Right.
So another key area that is often overlooked with regard to training and process development is establishing key goals and metrics. So we talked a little bit about metrics earlier, like cost per lead
Right.
and call volume, and we brought up the idea of lead yield, but cost per
Yeah.
opportunity. Having establishing key goals that are actually informed by some sort of like relevant sort of revenue goals
Yep.
is way more effective than just putting someone in a seat and seeing what's possible.
Yeah.
Right.
Right? You have
Or
to
coming up with an arbitrary number and saying, okay, one SDR, you get
Yeah.
a lead a day.
I know.
And that's what I heard, and that's
Yeah.
what you're going to do.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
we even see it, I feel like, with some clients internally here. They don't necessarily know what their goal should be, so they do their best to work backwards, and they're like, maybe 4 is a good number. In month 1, the SDR gets 11, and they're like, looks like we have to readjust, and now your goal's 16. It's
Yeah.
like, did you really base that on anything
Right.
other
On
than
anything
that 1 month? Like,
Yeah.
Right.
no,
Especially
it's
if there's
not.
ever a month that's an outlier.
Exactly.
It's the first
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, you can't really, like...
Because they
There's a
have
lot
just
of other
a bunch of
variables, yeah.
inbound stuff they've never touched, or maybe they don't even have lists at all. Like
Yeah,
that
it's
month
like
is
the
kinda,
last thing you want to do is snap judgment on, is how you expect the performance of your team to look. You want to do it based on historical data.
Yeah, yeah. And then I guess the other big one here is Salesforce.com or CRM sort of reporting and dashboarding. So we talked again a little bit about metrics and some of the wrong metrics to track, but it's important to have a framework in place where this is going to be measurable and you're going to know whether or not it's successful
Right.
or not. Right. So oftentimes we work with clients that come to us and they say, yeah, I have 4 internal SDRs and they're doing okay, I think, but I have no idea how to tell. Like
Yeah.
they're hitting these meeting
Arbitrary
goals, but
nothing's
like nothing's really
converting,
closing.
like we haven't closed anything.
And I can't really get a ton of I just
so they don't
know
even
how
know what to
effective-
expect.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the context of this pitfall we're talking about, oftentimes people are like, yeah, it's easy, I'll just hire somebody, and they neglect to develop any sort of logical sort of way to measure it.
Right.
Obviously it's destined to fail. You
Right.
know, you're never gonna be able to.
You don't know what you're looking for.
You don't know what you're looking for.
Yeah, you can't have someone replicate what you're looking for if you don't know what that is.
And I think being really clear on expectations out of the gates is hugely important, right? You may not know what the lead goal should be, and you need time to develop that, but at least expectations around, call activities, connections, how many accounts do we need the SDR to be touching, that will help drive the SALs and SALs.
And those are all like
down the road.
benchmarkable metrics that exist for different industries that have been proven to in some capacity show success. Like based on what industry you're in, you know that you can have your SDR hit, like you said, X goals and X connects and get X meetings, and that should be viewed as a success. But like if you look back at it and nothing's working, then reevaluate.
Right. So instead of picking a number to hit, pick a metric to track.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that.
Something else I know you guys wanted to touch on were the pitfalls related to misjudging the cost of building out and maintaining a sales development function.
The big point we were trying to make on cost
Well, I
was,
think we were talking about, I think people either underestimate or overestimate how much this is going to cost, or maybe they just underestimate how much this is going to cost. Does that go back to like not having the right management infrastructure in place and the right technology to enable these SDRs to be effective at their job, giving them guidance and time? I think that's kind of where, and then going back to measuring the cost on a CPL, cost per lead basis, is sort of the wrong way to look at this.
It's almost a factor of the previous two things. It's like if you don't have a good process in place and you don't have an idea of what metrics you want to track, like you're going to either underspend and not get what you want, or realize that you've made a mistake, overspend, and still not get what you want.
Right.
We can also touch on mishires and rehires and the cost of repeating those expenses.
Yeah, especially if you're just hiring 1 or 2 SDRs. I mean, if you have a team of 8 to 10 SDRs and you have a manager and training and a repeatable process, it's a lot easier to, if somebody leaves, which inevitably, if you have a good team, they will. They'll either get promoted or they'll leave on their own accord because a really good SDR will do that after 2 years or less. So I think that, if you have a team built out, it's easier to sort of recruit and sub somebody in. But if you only have 1 or 2 people, if 1 or 2 or both of those people leave, you have a gaping hole in sort of your pipeline development strategy.
Yeah.
And it's going to take you, I would say, at a minimum, 30 to 60 days to recruit and fill that position and train them, and then to get them productive is going to take another 90 on top of that. And especially for an enterprise software play.
And even almost in a worst case scenario, if you have those 2 SDRs and one of them leaves, the opportunity cost of that other SDR being forced to then retrain the new one is astronomical. Because you're not only having them retrain it and take money away from their own activity in terms of like not filling up your pipeline, but then the other SDR isn't doing anything. There's like this weird gap, like Lindsay mentioned, sort of like a trough that exists after the initial hiring period where you're losing money. And it takes X amount of months to sort of gain it back, and you have to be okay with that because ultimately they will prove out their ROI in the future, but you can't keep like dipping back into that trough, otherwise you just won't make money.
That's when clients will call me and they'll be in a panic because they'll say, we just lost 2 SDRs. We lost our SDR out on the West Coast and we lost our SDR out in Boston, and we need people to fill pipeline, and they're scrambling, right? And they know that and so they didn't really sort of think ahead, and you have to kind of expect and assume that these SDRs will turn over.
Right.
And there will be a cost associated
and there
with
needs
that.
to be a process developed around training, replacing those SDRs. In a lot of ways, these pitfalls all sort of work in conjunction with one another, because if you are the type of organization that takes the number 2 approach, like the training and like the lack of training and process development around this, and you don't sort of mentally commit or physically budget enough money to to make this, and you're not tracking the right types of metrics, a lot of times what happens is that it'll become a hell of a lot more costly than you know, if you, it's almost like if you believe it's going to be less costly and you think it's almost like an afterthought, it'll inevitably become more costly.
Right. Understand what you want to get out of this,
Right.
and that it takes time. So that kind of moves us into the fourth pitfall, which is really around not giving this function or the sales development team enough time to perform and to get productive. So I often will see and talk to clients and organizations who, you know, they become really short-sighted. They want to see closed business or pipeline or, you know, full production of you know, full lead production within 30 days. And if they don't see that within 30 days, they are starting to think the program is a failure. And what we've seen, especially, again, like in the case of enterprise software client that has longer, more complex buying cycles where things take time, it's going to take 90 days before an SDR team is at the point where they're consistently producing results month over month that you can, you know, hang your hat on and measure.
And if you're measuring the effectiveness of this function by closed business, which ultimately you should over a period of time, but if you're
Over
doing
enough
it
time,
too quickly, then yeah, you're probably going to miss out on it.
It's literally impossible if your sales cycle is more than 30 days.
Yeah, and I
Right.
think that speaks to sort of the metrics discussion we had earlier, which, you know, there's a ton of top of funnel metrics that we track early on in programs to measure effectiveness, right? Are we seeing a strong connect rate? Are we seeing a strong lead rate? What does the lead rate and the conversion from lead to opportunity
Right.
look like? And we track those early stage because, you know, in an environment where a sales cycle might be 9 to 12 months plus, you're not going to see any closed business after 90 days.
Right.
And so and so it's important if you want to track early progress, but
Of
you want
course,
to give
and
it
there's
you want to
things
be
you should look
realistic
at in the
and be
first-
realistic around what you can expect, which is sort of setting up that proper sort of process around
And giving the
metrics.
and you know, if the SDR is feeling this pressure that they need to be at full production in the first 30 days,
Right.
you know, that like inevitably they, you know, they will fail.
We also talk to a lot of people that have this sort of silver bullet mentality where
Yeah.
they'll come to us, and I can't remember what company it was, but they were like talking about an SDR program. They were interested in using Demand Drive, and you explained what we do, and,
Yep.
and you asked them about revenue goals, and they said, yeah, we need to, you know, want to hit like 18 million this year, and in closed business. And you said, okay, well, let me, you know, kind of do the math
Yeah.
with you and work out of that, and you're going to need a team of, you know, a number. Yeah, I can't remember what
I think it was
number.
like 8 reps or
Right.
whatever that was. Yeah.
And he was like, all right, well, let's start with one and see what, and basically his expectation, and this is true of a lot of people, is like they're going to turn this function on for the lowest cost possible, and it's
And-
going to deliver the results they're looking for, which is 18 million in closed business.
Which is
Yeah.
insane.
Right. I mean, it's not insane if you have eight people and
Right.
you have a proper
Right.
sort of
Everything
process
we
and strategy
talked about,
developed, but you know, so.
Yeah, it's not a Band-Aid. A lot of organizations look at it like Lindsay, the example you use, like, oh, my West Coast rep just left. I need someone to generate pipeline like now. Can you
Yeah.
help me? It's like, no, I can't help you.
Nobody
Like,
can help.
Yeah.
This isn't a
This
Band-Aid.
takes
that
I can
just
help you,
slap
but
on.
we
Right.
need to set realistic expectations
Right.
as
Yeah.
far as
Yeah.
when we're going to be delivering
It needs to be a
consistent
long
results.
term.
We do see this also with people that take more of a Hail Mary approach. So you've got the silver bullet approach that I just talked to, and then you've got this Hail Mary approach where
Also
people,
trademarked,
this, like, nothing has been successful, right? They haven't had success building this function internally. They haven't had success without this function. They've
Yeah.
got field reps that are, you know,
Yeah.
that are supposed to be generating their own business. But that's not working. They try to build this out. It doesn't work. So they're like, Demand Drive, like,
Yeah,
like to turn on an
We're
SDR
not
and they want
magicians
to right
necessarily.
exactly.
Sometimes I feel like
So,
we
I really can't remember my point here, but
Hail Mary.
the Hail Mary approach, yeah. So,
silver bullet.
well, that's
The other.
the silver bullet is like, I want one SDR. Give me the lowest cost thing. I want it to solve
Oh, yeah.
all my problems.
Oh, okay.
The Hail Mary approach is like, I am way behind my goal.
Oh, and we're coming into
I have like
a day late and a dollar short.
yeah, and we
Okay.
have, and that's sort of this mentality where it's like, is this working after 90 days? Like, people are you have to have the right like mentality when building this function out, that it's
Yeah.
going to be an investment. You have to do it properly. It's going to be a long-term sort of return.
Yeah.
So
And you should
it
be
never
looking
inevitably
and,
doesn't work.
and the measures of success in the first 90 days are quite a bit different than
Right.
those that you're measuring in month 9 and beyond.
But why are those metrics different
Yeah.
between the first 90 days?
And which
month
metrics
9
are
and
those?
beyond?
Yeah.
The metrics I'm measuring in the first 90 days
Yeah.
are going to be sort of testing the SDR's ability to navigate through a conversation and be able to answer questions and get ramped up on the product. I'm going to be measuring call activity. I'm going to be measuring how the messaging effectiveness, right? And what is our open rate and response rate to some of our emails and subject lines. I'm going to be, measuring connection rates, like I mentioned, early lead rates. I'm going to be making sure that we are at least getting some meetings set up and that those are happening and we're getting some, positive feedback from the sales team. But I'm certainly not going to be looking at overall meetings and leads and opportunities on forecast in the first 90 days. I mean, unless this is a transactional product that, the like you said,
where you
AJ,
can
the
see
sales
that
cycle's
in the first
30 days.
30
But
days.
even then, it just takes time. I mean, you wouldn't if you hired a team of 6 SDRs, whether you are hiring them in-house or you're outsourcing to a vendor, you should not expect that team's going to be at full production in the first 90 days.
No, it's all cherries on top if they end
Yeah.
up passing anything over that moves through your
You should
pipeline.
see they should be on an upward trajectory,
Right.
but they early, like a couple meetings set up. They're getting the hang of it. They're able to you're listening to some of their calls. Like they're able to have good conversations with prospects, able to answer some of those high level questions. The messaging that you're using is resonating. People are picking up the phone. You're having conversations, but as far as like lead production and opportunity creation, that's not what I would be looking for necessarily in the first 3 months.
Yeah. I feel like it's more anecdotal in the first 90 days where like you're understanding that they can have a conversation, like you said, you're
Yeah.
looking through the notes, making sure they're not like, I don't know, bungling the messaging and like they can effectively speak to competitors and whatnot. And then after that, at 9 months, it's more quantitative where it's like, how many meetings are you
Yeah.
setting? What is the
Yeah.
ROI of the program?
So there's
like
more,
Yeah.
there's more
shift.
intangible signs pointing in the right direction in the
Right.
beginning, and then you can sort of see the concrete results of that as you pass
And you're
that
also
90-day
getting a
mark.
sense of like, some SDRs are just not the right fit to be an SDR. So that you're also testing that in the first 90 days. Sometimes they can be great in the interview process and it won't be the right fit on your team and you really won't know that right out of the gates, but you should have a good indication of it in the first 3 months.
Another point that could be potentially valuable here is we work with a lot of clients that don't. There maybe it's a new product in a new market, and so we'll work with them to develop, a sales development strategy, so a targeting strategy, persona strategy, message development, an effective outreach cadence, what sort of lead handover process and staging looks like, and then. Inevitably the results, because they were informed by a lot of like, we don't know, this is a test, sometimes the results aren't good, and oftentimes I have to tell the internal team like that's not necessarily bad. What we're doing is we're it's like a science experiment and you're basically like testing a hypothesis. You're creating a hypothesis, you have now checked that off. I can't remember, there's a famous quote by like Thomas Edison or something, and he was like when he was like developing the light bulb or something.
I think I know the one you're talking about.
And he said he tried like 9,000 different designs, and he said
I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work.
Exactly right.
Thanks,
So
Henry.
now look, there's never going to be a situation where you can try this 10,000 times and not have it work.
Unlimited.
You will not have a company either.
You won't. But the point is, like, if you take a systematic approach and you're testing a new market, like you may not see success early on, but at least you know that that's the wrong. Maybe that's the wrong persona to target, or you're using the wrong
Yeah.
messaging, or the wrong
It
vertical.
gives you information.
Exactly.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. That was really insightful. Do either of you have any last words you want to give to the audience? I know we covered a lot today.
No, I mean, I think that's a good sort of high level to get started, and like Alex, you mentioned at the start, if anyone has questions, we're happy to talk more in depth with anyone who's interested.
Yeah, I will mention, I think one of the kind of the bigger takeaway here is that, I think a lot of organizations think about sales development as sort of an afterthought. And if you don't sort of invest in sort of processes and understand that this can be an important part of a company, I think you're going to, kind of realize some of the pitfalls we talked about. today. And then on the flip side, I know we did talk about over-engineering this, so you have to be careful with that. So there's kind of a sweet spot in the middle. But
Find
again,
that
like
balance.
Lindsay mentioned, happy to answer any
Yep.
questions if you guys have any, to be a
Yeah.
resource for you.
Yeah, so obviously, like I said at the top, feel free to email myself or AJ if you have questions. If you want to reach out to Dan and Lindsay as well, I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you
You know
about
where to find
working.
us.
Yeah, exactly. Working to build out your own sales development program. So thank you guys so much for doing this
No,
with us.
thank
It's
you.
been a great experience, great time.
All right, thanks.